Welcome to the C-Suite Sherpa podcast. I'm your host, Brian Marshall, where we shine a spotlight on the great experts and resources for the C-Suite. And speaking of great resources, we've got a good guest today with us. His name is Neil Schaffer. Neil, tell us about your business.
So thanks, Brian. So Carlton Advisors helps B2B companies that are tired of failing to increase sales. We're a strategy consulting firm. Our clients depend on us to help define and revive their strategy, which leads to superior sales growth and pricing power, which in turn drives earnings and cash flow. So in a nutshell, it's faster growth and bigger exits. After 5 years as president of a software company that automated pricing and revenue management for multi-billion-dollar companies, we were doing pricing recommendations and revenue management. In my career, I've been successful in leading mid-sized B2B companies during rapid growth and scale, sometimes as chief operating officer, most often as chief financial officer, and a strategic partner to some really amazing CEOs. 10 M&A transactions, several exits, about 20 plus financing transactions, an IPO, secondary public offerings, and several private equity and private debt offerings. The reason I started the practice is that small and mid-sized businesses are vital forces in our economy. They're at the heart of innovation, employment, and economic growth. The challenge is that they're usually under-resourced. They're always short of people, time, and money. They often lack long-range planning, discipline, and a good understanding of how to grow by acquiring other companies. So those are areas that I can bring my expertise to bear in a cost-effective way to create economic value for my clients. In my experience, Brian, superior strategy and sound execution determine revenue success. Sales growth and pricing power spring directly from competitive advantage, and that depends on superior strategy executed with integrity. No or poor strategy, no or poor revenue performance. And all the downstream metrics of earnings and returns and cash, they all suffer as a result of not having sound strategy executed well.
So let's dive down a little bit deeper. So you and I were talking offline, and in full disclosure, you and I have known each other for a while. Neil's been a good friend, and I trust Neil, and I highly recommend Neil, by the way. The clients that you work with, give us a sense of geography, where you focus, and a little description of what would that profile look like?
Yeah, so thanks, Brian. It's privately held B2B companies, particularly software manufacturers, wholesale distributors, and brokers, ideally in the New York tri-state area. Typically profitable, privately held companies with 40 to 200 employees and revenue between 20 and $150 million is typically the zone. Motivated to power into hyperscale. Companies that we usually will engage are about to, or really starting to hit on all cylinders, and their business is scaling. They don't necessarily have all the resources required. So companies that are going into hyperscale that need some help and experience in managing through all the scale factors. Growth requires capital. It requires a bench of human resources that they may or may not have, and the ability to recruit those people. So that's an area of focus. I think the other area of focus is re-energizing companies that have been growing rapidly, and now their year-over-year growth has started to decline. I think you and I have consulted with enough and owned enough businesses that they know that leadership gets so close to the company that very often when things change, you're so close to running your company that you don't see it. You start to experience it, but you're also not necessarily at enough of a remove to be able to know how to attack a problem. So I think coming in from the outside to focus entirely on problem solving and revenue puts me in a position where the only thing I relentlessly focus on is growth and performance improvement.
One of the things that I know about you and your background is that there are a lot of good consultants out there, a lot of good advisors. But what I love about your background is that you've actually been in the seat of the decision maker in the past. You know what it's like to sit there and try to do this by yourselves, right? This is one of those things where you get to a point in life where you're running the biggest business you've ever run. It's really time to start asking for help. And I'm curious, when you start working with a client, what are some of the things from their perspective that they're going through? Things like they're stuck, they've plateaued, anything that's a major trigger that someone might say, hey, I know someone who's going through that.
Yeah, so if it's companies that are about to go through significant growth where their business is performing well and they see the opportunity to scale, whether organically or through acquisition, some of those indicators are significant increases in staff, the payroll services and the accountants and the insurance brokers who were seeing like, oh, wow, I didn't realize you went from 30 to 70 employees or 30 to 60. That's the kind of indicator that would be like, wow, this company's cooking. How do we put this in hyperdrive? They're moving in the right direction. Now, what's missing? What are the gaps? I think for companies into that portion of the growth curve or the S curve where they're starting to flatten out and decline, the indicators are usually pretty clear. Pricing power gets diminished, discounting increases, margins are compressing, gross margins are compressing, they're not making as much money, pricing is not keeping up with cost of goods, especially in an inflationary environment. The accountants and bankers tend to be very good observers of that kind of financial distress, a change in financial condition. If they're watching carefully, if they're really paying attention to how their clients are performing period over period on trend, they'll identify that. Bankers in particular tend to get very nervous when their clients' cash and cash flow is going in the wrong direction and they've invested a fair amount of debt capital into those companies. They have a lot of money on the line when businesses are not performing quite as well as they used to be. That tends to be a referral to me quite often to go in and assess a business and figure out how to help them get back onto the growth curve.
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw a survey that came out, and we've seen a huge uptick in small business enthusiasm and confidence going into 2025. Uh, what are some of the challenges you see coming up over the next year or so that businesses really need to be prepared for? And how would you help them prepare for?
There are a lot of macro challenges that are occurring, the sort of social and political challenges that are, I think there are a lot of unknowns going into a new administration, in particular for small business, about what the set tariffs will or will not disrupt their supply chain. A lot of companies are already making preparations. They're investing a lot of capital to be able to advance purchase inventory, especially from overseas. That's putting a lot of pressure on cash flow because they're investing in what they shouldn't. No one wants to invest in excess inventory and buy a lot of product before you need it. They're being forced into doing that, which means early next year, especially if interest rates continue to decline a little bit, there's going to be both the need and the opportunity to attract and acquire debt capital. Um, so that's one place where I tend to work with my clients to focus them on how do we go about refactoring or rearranging your capital structure, and particularly your debt structure, to move toward something that provides for more flexibility for long-term growth. Private equity capital has been very hard to attract over the past couple of years. The private equity deal flow has been clogged. There's about $1 trillion of dry powder between private equity and venture capital funds that are sitting on a vast amount of capital that they're not deploying for a variety of economic reasons. A lot of my clients are looking toward or leaning toward an exit transaction in the next 3 to 5 years. It's a really important consideration for people who are in their late 40s, 50s, and even into their 60s. They're thinking about, how do I monetize? What is my largest personal asset? I think there's going to be a huge opportunity when the private equity transaction cycle, when interest rates come down. I think there's going to be a massive amount of M&A activity in the second
Yeah.
half of 25 and beyond. We've had
And
very low activity. It's about time for that to break out.
you and I have that in common that we've both been involved in exiting a business. Having done it a few times in my life,
Mhm.
you having been through it is an extremely valuable asset because when I first did it, I gave the company away. I had no idea what it was worth. I thought it was worth X. It turns out it was worth 3X. That's one thing. The other thing I know about you too is that you help companies identify and manage risk. As we move forward, there's just more risk out there with the way things are changing and the rate of change, a different set of eyes and ears that have been across lots of different industries to, help identify and manage risk is important. Neil, I wish we had another hour to dive into the kinds of things that people need to know about you. Maybe we'll do another interview where we can go a little bit deeper. So, Neil, before we start sharing how people can contact you, I want to do something a little bit fun with you. I've got this thing called the lightning round where I'm just going to ask you some quick questions and you're just going to give
Mhm.
me whatever comes to mind. At the end, we'll share how people can get in contact with you. So, are you ready?
Great. Go ahead.
All right. So, here we go. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
I knew the answer to that one. If you can only grab one item during the zombie apocalypse, what would it be?
Coffee.
Favorite quote or phrase that you think about often?
There is no try. Do or do not.
The great philosopher Yoda.
Yoda.
How about a favorite movie?
I have a lot of them, but I'll stick with Star Wars for the moment.
Okay, cool. That's one of my favorites as well. At least one that I quote all the time. How about more contemporaries? Is there a streaming series that you like? Anything
TV.
like?
I've been watching House of Cards, Breaking Bad, and other things on Netflix that are 3 and 4 and 5 years old, like The Sopranos.
How about a bucket list item that you have accomplished already in your life?
So touring Italy for a few weeks was a bucket list item that I've done and would love to do it again.
Anything else that you haven't done yet that you want to do?
Very much want to go to New Zealand and had plans to go. My daughter lives in Sydney, Australia. I was going to meet her in New Zealand, time check, late February 2020. And so the world shut down, Australia shut down more than most. So we canceled that trip and haven't quite been able to put it back on the books again, but I'm hoping to do that within the next 12 months. Meet her in New Zealand, tour around for a couple of weeks, and then spend a week in Sydney to go back there and enjoy that place.
Awesome. Last question. Biggest obstacle or challenge that you've ever had to overcome personally, and what's a big lesson you learned from that?
So I think the biggest adversity was losing a business. There was a business I was running. We were in the midst of negotiating a $40 million equity financing with American Express and GE Capital in 1999. The financing would enable us to launch an internet privacy product at scale with American Express as my first client. Jack Welch personally sent the edict down from on high and said, pull all of your term sheets when the internet bubble burst. Amex followed suit. Deal fell apart. We shut the company down, costing
Yeah.
my initial investors, my partners, myself several $1 millions, and it's just business just gone. And so, look, I think the learning there is I've got a really high tolerance for uncertainty and risk as an entrepreneur. My DNA shapes my advisory work to some extent. Having lost that business and then subsequently in 2001 lost another one after 9/11, I think in both cases, if these companies had larger cash reserves and a gold-plated balance sheet, we might have been able to hibernate and weather the storm. So what I've learned is to expect the unexpected, fortify my financial capital to withstand storms and black swan events. I recommend to my clients that they relentlessly manage their relationships with customers, their product portfolios, margins and cash conversion cycles, line up credit when you don't need to borrow the money, take all the equity capital on offer. If someone's trying to give you more money than you think you need, take it anyway. Because dilution, in my opinion, is usually a fiction, and it doesn't matter when the ship is about to go down.
I agree. Someone wiser than me once told me that businesses don't die, they commit suicide. I've been through the same thing. We've made these mistakes and they make us stronger if they don't kill us. Frankly, if I'm hiring an advisor, I want somebody who's been through that. I want somebody this isn't their first time experiencing failure because I don't want them to go through that first time with me and my money. I'd rather they have learned that lesson and they help me not have to learn the lesson by having failed. So,
Yeah,
appreciate you
Brian, I
sharing that.
couldn't agree more. I think as I've brought advisors into my businesses over my career, it's been really important to have, you said the C-suite Sherpa, that notion of, having a guide who has the map to the minefield. We all have scars and blown off limbs along the way. You want to have that map to the minefield so that you can get safely to the other side. Having a guide is immensely important.
Well, I know we're out of time. Before we go, Neil, how can people reach out and contact you? And by the way, we'll post out all that on the description and the video on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, the best way is email at carltonadvisorsllc.com. I can be reached in several different ways, but email is probably the best way to schedule time and have an initial dialogue to see where opportunity lies.
Yeah, like I said, we'll go ahead and post all that. So if you haven't had a chance to jot that down, just check the description of the video and our YouTube channel. It's all there. Neil, I appreciate your time and your insights. Thanks for being a guest today.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you so much for inviting me.